I have a question. How does a movement made up of 19,000 believers spread across over 19 communal villages go from looking like this to now only having 2 members left? It all starts here, Manchester, England, on February 29, 1736, the birth of Anne Lee. Her father a poor blacksmith and her mother left unknown. Her childhood was spent in the muddy and crowded neighborhood of Toad Lane. In her teens, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, Anne began work in a textile factory and later a cook in an infirmary. The exposure of moral decay in the city triggered Lee to develop an early revulsion for sex. This revulsion turned into her analysis of human sinfulness. She became convinced that celibacy was the ultimate route to absolution. Lee was able to see the sin and despair in Toad Lane and felt as though there must be a higher purpose to life. She looked to religion but found the official church to be lacking what she needed. In 1758, Lee found the spiritual refuge she had been looking for when she joined a religious society led by former Quakers Jane and James Wardley. Jane and James, wife and husband, had been Quakers but could not find the inner peace they wanted. Quakers are known for being pacifists and some of the first missionaries to seek religious freedom in the colonies. They played a heavy role in America as abolitionists and supporters of women's rights. The Wardley Society, or as it was then called, the Shaking Quakers, had many things in common with the Quakers, including reliance upon inner light for the revelation of spiritual truth. In meetings, the worshippers openly confessed their sins and were soon carried away with violent shaking, singing, shouting, and dancing. Among the Shaking Quakers, Anne Lee experienced a sense of belonging. Against her feelings toward marriage and celibacy, Lee's father forced her to marry Abraham Stanley, a blacksmith at her father's shop. She gave birth to 4 babies, but each only lived a few months. The guilt followed her, and she thought her marriage was sinful and that God was punishing her. This was a key event into her becoming Mother Anne. Lee was jailed on several occasions due to disturbing the peace. The Shaker worship seemed bizarre to most, which incited hostility in her neighbors. The Shakers would interrupt local congregations, railing against their church. It was during a lengthy incarceration Lee saw the grand vision of the very transgression of the first man and woman in the Garden of Eden, the cause wherein all mankind was lost and separated from God. From this vision, Lee was declared the female successor to Jesus, the incarceration of the second coming of Christ, and from then on referred to herself as Mother Anne. Following a period of religious persecution in England, Mother Anne saw the spiritual awakening in the American colonies as an opportunity to practice without persecution and to grow as a movement. Lee and 8 of her disciples boarded the ship Maria and arrived in New York Harbor on August 6, 1774. Mother Anne learned from some Quakers that it was possible to obtain cheap land about 100 miles north of the city. The Shaker men took a long-term lease on some land about 7 miles northwest of Albany. After a year of developing the land, they built a simple log shelter. In the late 1700s, Anne and her group moved from the city to their land to start the first Shaker settlement in America. In 1779, a religious revival took place in Lebanon Valley, New York, about 30 miles from the colony. Some of the leaders visited the Shakers and joined them. They came from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Some went home and formed Shaker colonies of their own. Since a number of new converts were from the New England colonies, Lee and her 2 leading disciples, William Lee and James Whitaker, went on a preaching mission throughout Connecticut, Maine, and Massachusetts. In May of 1781, they set out on horseback on a tour that would last more than 2 years. The mission was of tremendous importance to Shaker history, with the town of Harvard, Massachusetts serving as home base. Several new communities were established throughout New England. Although successful, the mission was marred by repeated attacks of mob violence in which several Shaker leaders were horsewhipped. Anne herself was dragged out of a dwelling and thrown into a carriage to be shamefully and cruelly abused. When Anne finally returned home to New York on September 4th, 1783, the violence of the New England mission had left her in a weakened condition. Her final days had been spent sitting in her rocking chair, singing in unknown tongues. She died on September 8th, 1784, a year after the New England trip. Her disciples buried her in a simple wooden coffin after a rousing Shaker celebration of her life and her passing into the realm of spirit. In spite of her convictions concerning celibacy, which doomed the Shakers to eventual extinction, Anne Lee was in many ways a progressive 18th century woman who made a significant impact on her world. She was a pioneer for justice and equality. She taught by example the equality of the sexes, economic justice, religious tolerance, and true democracy. The Shakers in America lived a communal life based on common ownership of property and goods, celibate purity, and confession of sins. The Shakers did not believe in procreation, and therefore had to adopt children or allow converts into their community. The adopted children were given a choice at age 21 whether to remain with the Shaker community or go their way into the world. The Shakers eventually created 19 official communities in the Northeast, Ohio, and Kentucky. The Shaker faith spread to include roughly 6,000 members just before the Civil War. The name Shaker originally comes from the insult shaking Quakers, which mocked the sector's use of their bodies in worship. Laboring dances would be planned and practiced meticulously by the Shakers. There are no dance partners, which is a reflection of their celibate lifestyle. The primary gesture used was a shaking off of sins. Believers beat time with their forearms parallel to the floor and palms facing down. Mother Anne and the Shaker Church will forever be known for the morals they brought to society and its effect on gender equality that was practiced at each communal village. Although only one village is left in Maine, Mother Anne predicted Shakerism would dwindle to a few members, but says it would then overcome all nations.